Well, welcome everyone on this bright, sunny Monday afternoon. It's our very last CCOVI Lecture Series in our set this year. It's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Gary Pickering. Gary is not only one of our CCOVI researchers in the Institute, but he's also a professor in biological sciences and cross-appointed to psychology as well. So Gary holds his doctorate in wine science from Lincoln University in New Zealand, and in fact, just came back from a 3-month research collaboration with colleagues in New Zealand and Australia as well. Yes, so just freshly back last week. He's had a few days to reacclimatize to our time and our great weather that we're now starting to have. Spring has finally sort of started to arrive. Gary's teaching and research focus is on wine flavor, sensory science, the development of novel wine products and processes. He's published over 100 papers, patents, book chapters, and conference proceedings. But in addition, he's also an inventor. He's invented a number of wine educational products, including the wine mouthfeel wheel and Wine Awakenings wine aroma kits. And I wasn't aware of this one, also a super tasting kit, so I'll have to get more details on that one soon. Today he's going to be talking to us about his current research program, SNPs, snobs and snouts, the influence of biology, expertise, and taste in wine preference segmentation of North American consumers. So, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Debbie. I could sell you a super tasting kit afterwards if you like. It's to see me. Welcome everyone, and thank you for your interest. What I want to do this afternoon is give a summary of some research that's just beginning in our lab, and for me marks a move to the dark side. Trained as a traditional biologist and also employed by the Department of Biological Sciences, most of my research to date has focused on biological aspects of taste and flavour and how they might relate to things like diet-related disease risk and things like wine flavour. The last couple of years I've become increasingly interested in the questions of so what? How does some of this biological stuff, for instance, how genes influence taste and flavour perception, how might they translate into the marketplace? How might they make a difference for marketers and even wine producers in terms of how they target and do their jobs? So be gentle, please. Traditionally, wine marketers will look at a potential or existing wine market and break it down in terms of areas like demographics, disposable income, gender, and so on. Or they'll look at an existing market in terms of lifestyle and segment the market that way. And occasionally they'll look at things like psychographic variables. What I want to do is, in this particular study, is look at a combination of variables that traditionally are not used together when considering a wine market. And some of that is evident in the alliteration of the title, and I want to just go over that now because I'll forget later on. SNPs, an acronym for single nucleotide polymorphisms, essentially one source of genetic variation between people. And in this particular study, it's a source of variation that helps explain sensitivities to different tastes and flavours, including those that we find from wine. Snobs. One simple experiential measure that we will use in this study is wine expertise. And those with great wine expertise I have called and shall call snobs, at least in terms of this talk. And snouts, this thing here, anything that relates to taste and flavour. And we have some proxies in this study for taste and flavour that I also want to bring in to a consideration of what this might mean for how we consider the US wine market. This particular paper, which is in the final stages of being prepared for publication, two co-authors, Aaron Jane and Ram Bazawada, and both Aaron and Ram professors in the marketing school at the University at Buffalo. So they've been key collaborators in gathering the data and in helping to analyse it. In the general area of flavour and taste research, and particularly in my lab how it relates to genetics, a whole team of folks have come before them and have helped contribute to either directly or indirectly to some of the data that I want to show to you today. So Dr. Andrea Bottazatu, Nancy de Corville from psychology, David Batista from psychology, Gail from CCOVI, Professor Ping Liang from Department of Biological Sciences, and Linda Van Zuyden, sensory technician at CCOVI. Linda, before she left, did not leave me with a good photo of herself, so scouring the web. She in fact does not have a special needs helmet on. Apparently it's part of a Sportster club that she belongs to, racing old sports cars. And two colleagues from outside of Canada, John Hayes, a professor at Penn State Uni, and Anth Saliba, professor at Charles Sturt University in Australia, who I spent some time with as part of this last research trip. And of course all the students, both current and ex-students whose work I'll be presenting again, either directly or indirectly. And of course the funding body, nothing gets done, nothing without money. So NSERC Discovery has provided some base funding for much of the work that I'll be talking about, and a couple of specific development grants to my colleagues in Buffalo, and also an anonymous wine retail shop in Buffalo provided significant resources to help us do this work. A couple of slides just to introduce the US wine market, because our cohort, our sample, is drawn from upstate New York US wine market. It is now, by a significant margin, the world's largest wine consuming nation, period. It's now replaced both France and Italy in terms of volume and value of wine. I think significantly we've seen incremental increases in the size of that market every year. For a number of years now, despite a global recession. So the US is where it's at now in terms of being a global leader in terms of wine consumption, and the trends look very positive. Just over a third of Americans report drinking wine on a regular basis. Per capita consumption there around 12 litres per annum. And just from simple sources like Gallup polls, we know there are some differences within the US population, one of which is significantly more women drink wine than men. No surprises there. The culture of drinking wine in the US is changing drastically. Historically, wine was only consumed in very formal settings, traditionally religious ceremonies and with meals. And some work over the last several years has shown that the trends are changing significantly. And in fact, Thatch identified 9 types of occasions in which wine is becoming increasingly part of the social milieu within the US. So things like date nights and family get-togethers. So more and more we're seeing wine in the States being used for more informal settings. And one of the consequences of that is US consumers are experimenting and trying a much wider variety of wine styles and also price points than has been the case in the past. That should ring some bells in terms of marketers, in terms of opportunities. We are looking at a growing marketplace and one whose basic wine behaviour patterns is changing. That speaks to marketing opportunities. And part of what marketers do is both identify new potential market segments and also try and better understand existing market segments, and then apply the various marketing and branding tools to try and exploit those segments, and also inform production to try and optimize production for particular market segments. What influences wine consumer behaviour? Why do you buy what you buy? could spend a lifetime looking at that question, and we know that there are a large variety of both intrinsic and extrinsic factors that drive wine consumer behaviour. But one thing that we keep coming back to in the literature time and time again is the pivotal role of flavour or taste in driving consumer behaviour. That might not seem like a Nobel Prize winning statement, but many marketers would probably differ with those conclusions. But when you control for other variables, flavour and taste drive consumption. We buy and drink what we like. Yes, accessibility, yes, price are critical factors, but taste is paramount. So let's define this term, because we'll be coming back to it multiple times later in the talk. I'm using taste in a technically incorrect way here, in the colloquial way in which we say something tastes good. It's an acronym for flavour. And wine flavour is comprised of three different things. It's comprised of basic tastes, and in wine they're typically sourness, bitterness, excuse me, and sweetness. So sourness, bitterness and sweetness are the main basic tastes we find from wine. Flavour or taste in wine is also composed of what's called kinesthetic sensations, tactile or touch sensations. They're often a lot more important than what we thought was the case historically. Things like the astringency, the drying sensation of red wine. Things like the prickling, tingling sensation of carbonated sparkling wines. The sense of heat or coolness is another example of a tactile or kinesthetic sensation. The burn or irritation from alcohol. These are all tactile sensations and part of what we call taste. The final part of wine flavour is in fact smell. So much of what we say when we say a wine tastes good, we're actually referring to smell. So that tastes like strawberries, or that tastes like wet dog, is in fact a comment about what we call retronasal olfaction. That is, the smell of strawberry or the smell of wet dog, in fact, is making its way, when you swallow the wine, back up to the olfactory bulb or olfactory mucosa, which is where smell is processed. So much of taste, in fact, is smell. Flavour or taste is basic tastes, tactile sensations and smell, all combined together into the psychological construct. Given that we do have a very wide range of flavours in wine available for both for manipulation and for sale and for selling, and given what we know about variation in taste sensitivities, a number of commentators have suggested there is opportunity here for combining the two together and identifying market segments based on what's called taste phenotypes, different flavour profiles that different individuals possess in terms of their sensitivities. There are two or three taste phenotypes that you'll see in the literature. So a phenotype I'm talking about here is the expression of one's underlying genes into something that you can observe. It can be something like your liking towards a particular product. It can be something like a threshold or the perceived intensity. But a taste phenotype is the expression of underlying genes into, in this case, taste perception. So this prop phenotype we'll talk about for a little bit, again as part of setting the scene before we look at how this might matter for wine consumer behaviour. So by far and away, if you type in taste phenotype into a Google search, this word prop will pop up 9 times out of 10. Prop is an acronym for a compound 6N-propylthyrosol. You can see why we call it prop. It's not even found in nature, it's not found in food, it's an artificial compound. But the really interesting thing about this compound is that if you give it to people and ask them how does it taste, you get 3 very distinct responses. You get people that cannot taste anything in terms of the prop. They're called prop non-tasters. About half the population will experience this compound as being moderately bitter. We have very discrete ways of differentiating these people. I'm giving you the simple story here. They're called prop medium tasters, and anywhere from 20 to 30% of the population will go through the roof. They experience the compound as being incredibly, incredibly bitter. In fact, many describe it as the most intense sensation they've ever experienced. Not surprisingly, this term super taster is the colloquial term used to describe these people. So the significance of prop is that it can divide a sample or a population to 3 different phenotypes. We know they're phenotypes, that is, we know they have a genetic basis because we know the genes responsible, at least for most of the prop story, and they have variations in the TAS2R38 taste gene. And we know some of the physiology behind this. So for instance, prop super tasters have more taste buds, a lot more taste buds on average on their tongues than prop non-tasters. So more potential for signal to get transduced and eventually perceived as more flavour. So it's a phenotype because we know some of the genes involved. The really interesting thing for us in terms of wine consumption and food consumption is that your prop status, that is whether or not you're a super taster, medium taster or non-taster, is a proxy for general taste responsiveness. That is, the majority of studies, not all, but the vast majority of studies will show that your sensitivity to prop will be mirrored in your sensitivity to the sweetness of sucrose, the sourness of tartaric acid, the astringency of alum sulfate, and may even extend into retronasal odorants. That is, things taste more citrusy or more vanilla or more strawberryish for you if you, for instance, are a prop super taster compared to a prop non-taster. Administering prop is really quick and dirty. It can take seconds to do, so it can be a great proxy for underlying genes. Doing the genotyping is both expensive and somewhat time-consuming, particularly for a large population. So we're using the phenotype, the sensitivity to this one compound, as a quick and dirty, if you will, estimate of one's underlying genes. Now, not only does prop predict your general taste or flavour responsiveness, again with a few important caveats, it also predicts, in many studies, how you perceive food and beverages. So, for instance, prop super tasters experience high-fat dairy products. They experience the fat sensation more intensely than, say, prop non-tasters. Well, that may have some interest for the dairy industry in terms of product optimization, in terms of brand positioning, but also think about that over the course of a lifetime. If you're a prop super taster, in this instance, you experience the fattiness of high cream products more intensely. Net result, you tend to drink or consume less of the high fat products, and there is some work that shows that does have long-term health consequences in terms of lower lipid levels, for instance, which are associated with coronary heart disease. So there is some literature that suggests this whole prop story translates all the way from perceived intensity in food, liking of food, consumption of food, and diet-related health conditions. So what? What's it got to do with wine? Well, over the last 10 years or so, our lab's been looking at the so what question, and I want to just pull up a couple of slides that summarise some of the work that we've been doing. The so what is, it looks like your prop status also matters in terms of predicting how you experience the sensations in wine. So this was one early study in which we have 3 different categories of normal, they were students, I suppose they're normal. A normal sample of the population, non-tasters, medium tasters, and super tasters. And here we have the 3 dominant sensations elicited in red wine. This data is averaged across 3 red wines. The story was the same no matter which wine you used. And this is perceived intensity. And you can see the story is that the non-tasters have lower perceived intensity. They're experiencing these sensations less intense than the other 2 phenotypes. Depending upon how you classify people and what sort of wine you use, you get a similar pattern of response. Often it's the super tasters are much higher than the other 2 groups. That wasn't the case in this particular experiment. We're very verbose in the wine community, and we love to use fancy terms to describe wine and impress people. And sometimes when we're doing that, we're trying to describe some of the complex oral sensations that we find in red wine. And so we completed a study some years ago. It was actually looking at yeast strain influences on the mouthfeel of red wine. But we happened to also categorise our tasters according to their prop status. And that's what this graph is. There were 9 sensations in total. I've just captured a subset of those. This is the average intensity of the sensation. In this case, we had no medium tasters, just the non-tasters here and the super tasters here. And you can see actually the statistical results are not showing, but they're all significant. The trend is all the same. The super tasters are experiencing things more intensely than the non-tasters, and these are, if you will, sub-qualities of astringency. And in some cases, in fact, there are some qualitative differences that are being experienced between these two phenotypes. What's not shown here, but what this slide speaks to, is another phenomenon that we've just become aware of with prop super tasters and other food products, and that is it looks like they have greater acuity. So not only do they experience things in the mouth more intensely, no matter what those things are, they look to be better at discriminating finer sensations in the mouth. And there's various studies, including one from us, that show that. That may translate into greater capacity to appreciate nuances in flavour in complex foods or beverages, and we'll come back to that idea shortly. This is one study we completed a couple of years ago that got us into no end of trouble, so we did it again, got exactly the same result. It's one that wine writers don't like particularly much, but the data is what the data is. So just to be very brief, this y-axis here can be considered a probability index, and this x-axis the intensity of prop. And when you survey, in this case I think it was only 300 or 400 people, but in latter work it's been over 1,000, when you survey people and determine their prop sensitivity or their prop phenotype, then ask them or rate them in terms of their jobs, you find this, that normal wine consumers who have a job other than being in the wine industry tend to be non-tasters and medium tasters. This intensity here corresponds to a non-taster. This intensity here corresponds to a medium taster. But I've told you the wrong story, haven't I? That's the experts. So the red line is the wine experts. So self-rated wine judges, LCBO product consultants, and winemakers were the bulk of this cohort. And what I meant to indicate, in fact, was that non-tasters and non-tasters are underrepresented here in the expert group compared to normal consumers. And the reverse is true here. The red line here and here is higher than the blue line. That is, experts are more likely to be medium tasters and super tasters by a factor of about 2 to 1 in the case of super tasters than the consumers. As I say, this work's been since replicated with almost identical results. And have a think about that for a minute in terms of things like expert endorsement or product recommendations from the LCBO consultants, if in fact on average wine and the sorts of wines that winemakers produce according to their palates. These things have implications, I think, in terms of how there may be a disconnect between how experts and winemakers perceive wine and position wine and how consumers perceive wine at a very basic level of physiology and flavour perception. So we know something about the prop story as it relates to wine, but what we haven't known until this early study, this first study I'm about to show you, is so what? What does that all mean? What might it mean in terms of behaviour? Do super tasters prefer one sort of wine to another? Do they drink more wine or drink less wine? Because these are all measures that can be acted on in terms of the marketing machine. So what? What does this stuff all mean? Well, we formed 2 hypotheses at both ends of the spectrum. One idea is that essentially wine is something we shouldn't go near. We're culturalised to drink wine. At birth, we have natural aversions as humans. In fact, most animals have aversions to bitterness, to sourness, to astringency. These are all things typically in the animal world that indicate presence of toxins, or at least poor nutritional states. We are hardwired to dislike the dominant taste sensations in wine, period. So it's all socialisation and some positive reinforcement from the alcohol. That means over the span of a number of years we learn to like this damn stuff. So if the aversive sensations, sourness, bitterness, heat from alcohol, are perceived much more intensely by prop super tasters, that perhaps translates into avoidance of wine, or at least lower consumption. That's one hypothesis. The alternative, or an alternative, is just what I alluded to before, that potentially, well, we think we know now that prop super tasters do appreciate subtleties of flavour more. Their discrimination thresholds in sensory jargon are smaller for taste and mouthfeel sensations. That should mean that they can, in fact, detect and therefore perhaps appreciate some of the subtleties of a wonderful Côte de Beaune, or some of the subtleties in mouthfeel of a wonderful Chablis or a Niagara ice wine. These are complex products. Maybe that translates into people with higher prop sensitivity being able to get wine and its wonderful complexity more, and therefore they like and they purchase more wine. We just don't know. So that was partly what drove the current study. Also, some other variables that in the past have been linked to market segmentation we thought were worth looking at in the context of wine consumers. So one of those is food neophobia. We'll be talking about that shortly. The other simply is the idea of expertise. And strangely enough, there's almost nothing in the literature on the simple question, or do wine experts prefer and buy different types of wine than novices? There's nothing out there, even though we may think we know the answer anecdotally, and probably do. Nothing in the peer literature. And in general, wine market segmentation stuff is very hard to find in the peer literature. I'm sure it's being done, I'm convinced it's being done, but it's largely being done in-house or by very large organisations that, for obvious reasons, are at a commercial advantage by not sharing that information in the public domain. Well, we're going to look at that and see if we can contribute to that data. I mentioned food neophobia as one of the things that we were interested in looking at in this particular study. And simple definition is a reluctance to ingest novel food or beverages. And the other extreme of that is sometimes called food adventurousness, which is fairly self-explanatory. Food neophobia looks to be a hardwired characteristic of most omnivorous animals. We tend, including humans, so we tend on average to avoid novel foods. Through a process of learned safety, we do eventually, or can acquire, acceptance of novel foods, but it's actually a bit of work to get there. Typically, our primal state, if you will, is to, in fact, be relatively high in the food neophobic range. Some researchers have considered food neophobia as being actually a personality trait, and there are various scales out there that are being used to measure food neophobia and have shown some promising relationships in terms of personality types. One interesting thing for us is that some researchers found that your food adventurousness or your food neophobia in fact interacts with your prop status to help predict better the sorts of foods and beverages that you like. So for instance, chili peppers, products high in capsaicin, high in burn. Prop super tasters traditionally, if you look at the literature, go like this for those products. They can't stand them. Extremely high trigeminal stimulation. They experience the burn really high. But if you also measure the individual's neophobia, you find that you get two very clear differences within the super taster population. A bunch of people that won't go near chili peppers and products that use them, and a bunch of folks that can't get enough. So food neophobia is an important psychological variable that has to be considered within the prop story. In fact, it's closely related to another psychological trait called sensation seeking. Buying wine for most consumers is a high-risk business. There is intrinsic anxiety, if you look closely just down at the local LCBO, in the faces of many wine consumers as they're browsing the racks looking at what wine to buy. It's a high risk in terms of its social cachet. Is this the right wine for the mother-in-law? Yada yada. So arguably that its high risk status may predict that adventurousness will have an even more important part to play when it comes to wine purchase decisions. I mentioned expertise, and that was something we also considered in this particular study. It's a hard one to define. One working definition of expertise would be a combination or the sum of both sensory acuity and wine knowledge. So sensory ability and wine knowledge together perhaps approximate what we would often think of as wine expertise. I'd expect that one's level of expertise with wine would predict their liking of various wine products and their preferences and their consumption rates. Again, you look at the literature and the information's just not there. We know some things about wine experts. We know that compared to novice consumers, they differ in how much value they place on different aspects of the branding machine, different aspects of product packaging. And we also know there are some differences in olfactory recognition. Not necessarily underlying ability, but Wendy Parr's work has shown that wine experts do have better smell recognition than novices. And as I've alluded to, not much information in the literature. We were keen to look at how this might all play out. So we're finally there. This is what we set out to do. Two major objectives. The first was to look at how these three general types of factors, so psychological factors, biological, the taste genetics, and the experiential, the wine expertise, how they might all relate and interact when it comes to understanding the world's biggest wine market. Is it possible to segment the market in different ways that actually take into account three things that traditionally are not seen in the market segmentation literature? And then to delve more deeply into how these particular factors, expertise, adventurousness, and prop phenotype might ultimately affect preference and consumption. So we used the mailing list of a large Buffalo-based wine retailer and sent a survey to approximately 5,000 of their potential respondents. So these were individuals that belonged to a loyalty card system at the Buffalo wine retailer, but were not necessarily heavy users of the product. They simply had made use of a free loyalty card that was being offered in return for mailing address, so people like me can send nasty surveys. In the end, we had a response rate of just over 1,000, which represented about a 20% response rate, which we were very, very happy with, given this was unsolicited mail. The variables of interest for us in terms of dependent variables were primarily liking scores, so self-rated liking of wine. And we used the literature to determine 14 different major wine styles, and they are all listed there for you to see. So, I mean, there's some debate as to, is cider a wine or is it not a wine? Is flavoured fruit wine actually a wine? These are wine or wine-based products. Close enough, I think, in terms of the information that we were looking at gleaning. So we measured their liking scores, self-rated liking scores, and we measured their self-reported frequency and intake. People lie about what they drink, how much they drink. The best we can do is to use the tools that are available to us to make the best guesses about what actual consumption is. Now, the independent variables We use the classic demographic measures, so things like income, disposable income, number of children in the house, marital status, gender, years of education, and so on, which is typically where many of the existent wine segmentation studies start and finish. We added self-rated expertise in wine and adventurousness, and we also added a test of their prop status, which I'll walk you through now. The survey, I think, in total took around 35 minutes to complete, so it's about at the limit of how long you want to have individuals completing a survey before you get some sabotage. And there was incentives in terms of prize draws for those that completed the survey. So I mentioned the main variable of interest was wine liking score, and we used at the time a novel way of measuring liking. So traditionally in the food and beverage literature, a 7 or 9 point hedonic scale is the major tool that is used. More and more groups now are using this beast. It's called the Generalized Degree of Liking Scale. And it's starting to replace some hedonic scales because it's seen to be able to better discriminate between individuals in terms of their liking, because you're generalizing to liking that can be outside of the domain of the food or the beverage of interest. So this is what the scale looks like. There were significant instructions with this to help ease people through and examples. But essentially, respondents simply put a mark, a tick anywhere along this line. That corresponds to how much they like the particular product. And you can see it's anchored with the phrase strongest disliking of any kind, all the way through to strongest liking of any kind. And this, as I referred to, is not just limited to the domain of wine or food or beverages. So some of the items and so there was an individual scale was completed for each of the 14 wine products. And there were other items included as well. Spot the non-wine ones there. So a day off work, the smell of used gym socks, a foot massage. These things are deliberately included so that the respondents are trying to conceive of their responses for wine outside of just the wine or food modality. So that was the primary tool for gathering the response information, at least for this particular study, and very simple questionnaire for measuring intake. So on average, how many times per month do you drink the following products? We didn't list all 14 wines. We thought it was taking too much time. And then we have a simple question that follows that asks, on days when you do drink, how many standard drinks do you in fact drink? And of course you can get an estimate of total yearly consumption just by multiplying the information from these two responses together. So we can measure frequency of wine consumption and total wine consumption. In this case we annualized it, times it by 12. This is a very simple question that was previously validated in some earlier work from our lab, just to have a measure of neophobia or adventurousness. They simply were asked, how often do you try unfamiliar alcoholic beverages? Tick a box. We then further broke those responses down to create two groups, those that had low adventurousness and those that had high adventurousness. These two responses here were the low adventurousness, these two are the high. Just in terms of the statistical analyses, it made sense to break them down. And this is just the simple count here. We can see we have the significant majority of respondents can be considered as being low adventurous, or high neophobia, if you will. Quite surprising. I thought we would see a different, perhaps these two being flipped, but no, the majority of respondents were self-identified as having a low level of adventurousness towards alcoholic beverages. Likewise, the expertise question for wine was very simple. Tick a box that corresponds to how you rate your own level of expertise. There are intrinsic weaknesses in these sorts of simple questions. It's always a trade-off between the fidelity of the information and how many questions you throw into a questionnaire before the questionnaire itself gets thrown in the bin. So there were some, I got some concerns with this particular questionnaire, but it's the best we could do. I think the best way to measure expertise is to include some wine knowledge questions, and then you can objectively mark those. But we didn't. We used this. We collapsed this information into 3 groups. I think only 6 people responded as being expert or very high. And these are the 3 groups, and this is the breakdown here. And you can see we've got a nice distribution between the 3 levels of expertise. Most of our respondents are of intermediate expertise, but high enough numbers in the other groups that we can apply some robust statistics and see how it all comes out. So self-administering any task, I think, is difficult. So after lab testing various approaches, we settled on a simple instruction sheet to tell people how to measure the intensity of the prop compound that we gave them. This is simply one of the example sheets. It's by no means the full instruction sheet. So I had to get 5,000 round prop impregnated filter discs about yay big in little plastic baggies from here across the border to the US. It turns out that the US customs are not all that nice. So in future, note to self, mark the baggies as prop. These things do look, well, who knows what they look like. But we finally got these plastic baggies with the prop disc in the same envelope as the questionnaires and sent out to the 5,000 respondents. This is the response scale that participants were required to simply place a mark that corresponded to how intensely they experienced this prop disc once it was put on the tongue. I wouldn't recommend this method for small lab-based studies because there is various sources of variation in doing things this way. But when you're looking at sampling a population, in this case a population of 5,000, your numbers start to get big enough that some of the inadequacies of self-rating, I think, start to get balanced out. And using cut-off rates that we'd used previously, we were able to simply differentiate or categorise people into 1 of 3 categories based on how bitter they found the prop disc. So if they found it, if they rated it as 50 or higher, they were classified as a super taster. If they rated it at just above weak or lower, they were classified as non-tasters, and medium tasters are the messy group in between. And here's the breakdown here. And actually the breakdown represents close to what you would get using other means of measuring people's prop status. So the majority, a small majority, are medium tasters, and we have about 30% and about 20% either side as non and super tasters accordingly. So that's what our response data looked like. In terms of other broad characteristics of the sample set, I've mentioned we had over 1,000 respondents, over 1,000 people that completed all the questions, I should say, on the questionnaire. A bias towards female, average age 54. It's about the start of the legal drinking age in New York, isn't it? It's about 54 or so. So just neophobes. Race, very homogenous. The vast majority were white Caucasian. Years of formal education. Household income, just a shy south of 80,000. Annual wine intake, so about 430 standard drinks of wine per year. So these are, on average, I would say significant wine consumers, and frequency, 143 occasions per year they reported drinking wine of some description. Okay, so I'm going to skip over some of the statistics and jump to the simple dendrograph. Unfortunately, the writing there is not coming up very clearly, but simply this dendrograph is a way of looking at how the wines group in terms of the liking scores. How do they group when you assume nothing else? Throw all the wine liking scores from all the products into one mega-analysis and look at how they are grouped in terms of how similar or dissimilar their liking scores are to other products. Now, one thing I want to highlight is, and I'll read over some of these names in a minute, is to me that looks like products are grouping according to sensory qualities. People can score liking according to whatever criteria they want. We like things based on they're cool, they're fashionable, they're cheap, they're inexpensive. Many different criteria we can use to rate our liking of wine, but it seems to me that these wines are clustering according to simple sensory primaries. So for instance, red wine, dry sparkling wine and dry white wine all have a very high level of similarity. They're all dry in terms of sensory characteristics. Coolers, fruit wine, flavoured fruit wine, all group very early on in this analysis. They're all high aromatic, fruity wines, are they not? If we move across, we've got sweet rosé, sweet white, grouped according to sweetness, and we have our fortified wines all grouped together. Fortified wines elicit a common feeling of heat or irritation from the alcohol. So one of the first things for me anyway is that, oh gee, these wines are grouping according to what I would consider sensory characteristics, not necessarily price or other considerations. And we used some other statistics to derive how many clusters or groups that we should be looking at within this data set, and the solution was 3. So we re-ran a hierarchical cluster analysis to look at how or if we can segment according to these clusters. So all that's going into this analysis is the individual's liking score for the 14 different products. And I'll look at this in more detail in the next 3 slides, but we can see 3 different groups based on the separations here. We can then delve down to each of these 3 clusters and to look at some of the demographic characteristics that we have captured. So how does group 1, for instance, differ from this group here based on demographic information? In fact, cluster 1 is the most boring of the lot. This is cluster 1 that I've highlighted here. Okay, these are liking scores. Really only one thing stands out. There's a pretty high liking for this product here, which is red wine. And everything else drops off and stays around the ho-ha, neutral, slightly dislike area. Okay? We can categorise that cluster simply as red wine likers. Unfortunately, well not unfortunately, we'll come to that, they're male, so all these conclusions here are based on chi-square tests. We've run statistics to see if there are any differences between these different variables. So that these are predominantly male by a large margin, but there is nothing else differentiating this segment. They just tend to be males. Everything else in terms of income, genetics and so on look to be about average. So we've got a cluster of red wine likers. This second cluster here, I've highlighted in red. Characteristics are high scores for this product and this product. They are red wine and dry white, and really low scores for some of these products here. This is getting really low on the dislike scale, in fact. But are these products sweet rosé, dessert wine, flavoured fruit wine, wine coolers? These are all sweet products. So we have a cluster that I think we can summarise as dry table wine lovers and sweet dislikers. I think the interesting thing is we do have some significant differences in terms of the characteristics of this particular segment. They are they are older by far. They are the least ethnically diverse, even within a sample that's already pretty homogeneous. They're the most educated, they have the highest income, they are much more likely to rate themselves as being experts. And you might instantly think, yeah, it's because they're males. There's lots of truth in that. Males in any form of expertise tend to self-rate themselves as being much better than what they actually are. But statistically, it doesn't matter that even balanced for the male effect, this segment here is a lot more wine educated, or likely wine experts. They're not very adventurous at all when it comes to alcoholic beverage behaviour. They drink a lot more, and interestingly, they are much more likely to rate prop low, much more likely to be prop non-tasters or low medium tasters. So we have a cluster defined by traditional demographic information, but also defined by experiential factor, a psychological factor, and a genetic factor. It's information you would not traditionally get in a classic segmentation approach. The third cluster, these fellas here, we can see we've got high scores for these products here, and not a lot happening except perhaps a very low score here. What are these products? These are, as you might have guessed, all the sweet, or most of the sweet products. Wine coolers, sweet wine, and so on. Okay, quite significant differentiation. These are, I think, quite simply sweet wine likers. Characteristics, again, these are all significant, highly significant using chi-square tests primarily. Much more likely to be female, younger, lower income. I think you can already anecdotally sense that these findings mirror what we might normally see or think about when we're observing or talking about wine purchase behaviour. They have a much lower level of wine expertise, they drink less, and I think interestingly, they're much more likely to be prop super tasters. So again, I think with the cluster 3, we have both traditional demographic, but also some psychological and genetic information informing these different segments. So for the last analysis, in which we decided to collapse the 14 categories into 5 bins, just again for statistical purposes, and so the 14 wines were collapsed into 5 different types of wine. And we used ANOVAs to look at both liking and consumption for these 5 different bins of wine or wine styles. We looked at all the variables of interest, and we looked at their two-way interactions. So, just looking at wine liking now across the 5 different categories, we've broken folks down to low adventurousness and high adventurousness. And this scale's a bit deceiving. Essentially, just think of the higher up you go, the more the product is liked. It's a slight untruth, but let's stick with that for now. So the higher the score, the more the product is liked. And we can see that regardless of wine style, the black bars are higher than the grey bars. That is, those with high levels of adventurousness, alcoholic beverage adventurousness, are rating their liking for these wines significantly higher. Wine expertise, same general idea. This time we have 3 categories. The white bar are the beginners, the novices. The intermediate are the striped bar, and the very high level or high level of expertise is the black bar. And what we can see here is that for these, for table wine and for sparkling wine, and for fortified wine, in fact, we have this relationship between increasing expertise and increasing liking scores. And the reverse pattern when we're looking at sweet wines and wine-based beverages. I'm suspicious, in fact, that some of this behaviour towards wine-based beverages is in fact linked to sweetness. I mean, most of these products, like wine-based coolers, flavoured fruit wine, I think tend to be sweet anyway, but that's just speculation. So expertise, increasing expertise predicts higher liking, and these are big differences for dry table, sparkling and fortified, and the opposite relationship for sweet wine and wine-based beverages. Okay, prop stuff. Where the differences as a function of prop status. I think we've lost, oh no it is, so the white bar is non-taster, the horizontal bar is medium prop taster, the dark bar is super tasters. So for dry table wine, sparkling wine and fortified wine, The trend is for medium tasters and non-tasters to rate things in a similar pattern, and for super tasters to be the different group. And for those three products, super tasters tended to dislike or like less these three products. For sweet wines and wine-based beverages, there's some evidence of the opposite trend, that these were liked more, at least compared to non-tasters, by super tasters. So it looks like wine style matters, the type of wine, in terms of the influence that prop status has on liking. Of course, one of the things we want to know is to move beyond liking and look at actual consumption. Okay, well, how much do they drink? How much do they buy? How much do they drink is of particular interest to epidemiologists that study alcoholism risk, for instance. So just looking very briefly at the age and sex information, for each of these, the first set of bars is total intake over the course of a year. The second set is frequency. We're getting a trend. It's significant for frequency, not for consumption of increasing age, suggesting increasing rates of consumption. Perhaps nothing too surprising there. And in terms of gender, no difference for frequency, but males are consuming more wine. Sorry, they're not significantly. No, that's not different. So no difference in terms of sex for consumption behaviour in this cohort. Wine expertise. So we're seeing some clear trends, and that is that both frequency of consumption of wine and how much you consume varies proportionally and almost linear fashion with expertise. In some ways that shouldn't be surprising. These folks, almost by definition, have more involvement with wine. We might expect that their liking of the product would increase with expertise. Adventurousness. Nothing happening with frequency, but in terms of total consumption, the more adventurous individuals are consuming significantly more wine over the space of a year. And I think this is the last results slide, prop status. And what we're seeing, both for frequency, but particularly for total consumption, is an inverse relationship between your prop sensitivity and how much wine you report consuming. That is, prop super tasters consume less than medium tasters, who consume less than non-tasters. That would fit with some theories in terms of prop being a protective factor against some types of alcoholism. So, putting all this stuff together, I think that we can see we've identified three fairly clear and I think intuitively correct market segments within the US based on traditional clustering analysis. You know, red wine likers, table wine likers, sweet dislikers, and sweet likers. I think it's exciting, even if it's not, again, revolutionary, to see that these clusters are coming out so clearly based on simple sensory characteristics, which are often not considered in much marketing research. So I think these segments are plausible. I think for the first time we've looked at a full range of commercial wines, not just one or two styles. So you might have some confidence in how robust these findings are. I haven't shown another statistic we use, it's called an eta square. It's a way of working out, when you're looking at a model like this that has lots of factors, you know, age and gender and so on, what's the relative effect of each of these factors? And eta square can help with that. What we found was, of all the factors we looked at, level of expertise looked to be the most consistent, strongest driver of liking scores across the data set. But prop responsiveness and adventurousness had relatively high eta square values. They were also important in terms of the size of their effect. So my wish is that we go beyond looking at traditional demographic-only approach to considering wine markets and employ some of these psychological, experiential, and even genetic considerations when we think about wine markets in the future. And I'm convinced that if we do this, these afford opportunities for optimizing products, so particular wine styles for particular taste palettes based on on taste sensitivities, and also I think it creates opportunities for marketers in terms of understanding current markets, but also exploiting hitherto unidentified wine markets by using traditional wine marketing and branding tools. Thank you.
Some time for questions. Any questions from the group?
I just had one question regarding the adventurousness part of the questionnaire. Would that include different wine varietals when you asked about different alcohol types?
Yeah, great question. So just to repeat the question was, did the adventurousness question encompass the idea of different types of wine styles or wine varietals, I think, was that? The answer is no. And I think when asking about one's alcohol beverage adventurousness, I think it's a catch-all. I don't think it's a very precise way of capturing adventurousness. So the criteria I use for saying, yes, I'm very adventurous, compared to the criteria that you use may in fact be different. The reason why I'm confident with these results is that we did a smaller study with Ontario consumers, and we actually asked specifically about wine adventurousness rather than alcohol adventurousness, and got a very similar response pattern.
I have a question, Gary. In your 3 market segments, your dry red wine prefers the group that like dry wines versus sweet wines, and then the sweet wine. Of the, do you recall of the 1,000, approximately that you got the results from? How many were in each of those groups? I'm just curious, like across that segment.
Sure. So the question is, of the 3 segments that the cluster analysis identified, what is the sample size for each of those clusters? The answer is I can't remember, but each has several hundred. In other words, they are robust. There were definitely size differences, but they were several hundred each. But otherwise we wouldn't have used that solution, because it's hard to.
No, I was more curious about what was the biggest.
Oh, okay. Of those 3 clusters.
What's the biggest?
I actually can't remember, Debbie. It's a good question. I'll look up and get back to you.
Yeah, because it's such a, like, of the 1,000, that's a lot of consumers. I'm curious, are they mainly sweet wine drinkers, or are they the dry stuff?
It's a great question. Yeah, we have it in the paper, but I just can't recall the answer.
Any other questions? Okay.
Yes, are there any differences between males and females in their crop responsiveness, sensitivity to crop?
It's a great question. So the question is are there any differences between males and females in crop responsiveness? And again, I have to say, for this study, I can't remember. I'll need to go and look at that and can talk with you afterwards. In general, the answer is yes. In general, females tend to be overrepresented as super tasters. They're more likely to be super tasters. Whether or not that trend was true for this cohort, I can't recall.
Do you know if there are any studies that look at if there are changes in crop sensitivity correlated with age? So do we change as we age in our crop sensitivity?
Thank you. Another great question, which is, are there differences in one's crop sensitivity as we age? And the question is yes. In general, and we also saw it with this particular cohort, as we age, we're less likely to be prop super tasters. There's some debate as to why that is the case. The results I showed in terms of ANOVAs have taken into account those age differences, so I think they're robust. But yes, definitely in general, as we age, particularly once we hit the 50s and older, we tend to see less super tasters. They're still there, just not as many.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Gary, I have one more question. In your 3 segments again, you've got I think it was the group that like the sweet wines, they were super tasters, and mainly there was a higher proportion of women.
Yep.
And then the dry wine group, they were non-tasters and tended to be men. It's not a gender question, but So between the super tasters and the non-tasters, is the super tasters like the sweet wine? Does the sweetness like buffer the impact of those other senses? Is that like a working theory? Is that?
Yeah, but it's a great question. So I think the essence of your question is the higher sweet, the observation that prop super tasters preferred the sweeter wines, is that due to perhaps sweeter products masking the aversive negative bitterness, sourness, astringency and so on? The classic answer would be yes. For simple solutions, that work has been done and more or less reinforces that, because we know that sweetener is a classic way to reduce both bitterness and sourness, the sensations that are intrinsically aversive for humans. So in simple solutions, that's been shown to be the case. Is it the explanation here? I think it's not as simple as that, but I haven't got the evidence to support that. More research.
Any more questions? Well, please join me in thanking Gary.
Thank you. Thanks, Gibbs.
Small token of our appreciation, and this is our last lecture of the series this year, so please join us next year, come January 2015 for our new series. But also just a reminder that if you missed any of the talks this year, they are all posted on our COVI website, so we invite you to take in the full series, not only from this past year, but from previous years as well. I think we go back 3 or 4 years now. So thank you, and we'll see you all next year.